This is episode 42 of Ethics and Culture Cast from the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. Welcome to episode 42 of Ethics and Culture Cast from Notre Dame's DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. I'm Ken Hellenius, the communications specialist at the center. In this episode, we chat with Therese Cory, an associate professor of philosophy and the newest member of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas. We talk about reading Aquinas with undergraduates, the cross-cultural conversation around Aristotle's writings, and how the thought of St. Thomas is relevant to modern-day AI researchers. Let's sit down for this delightful conversation. Well, Therese, thank you so much for coming to be with us today.
Thank you for having me, Ken.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? Where did you do your studies? Those sorts of things.
Well, I was born in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, across from Detroit. I was homeschooled through high school and just got this tremendous interest in philosophy and theology through all the reading that I was doing through high school. I went to Ave Maria College in Ypsilanti, Michigan for a degree in theology and classics. Did graduate studies at Catholic University of America in D.C. From there, I had my first job at Seattle University, lived for a couple of years in Germany, and now here I am at Notre Dame.
Wow. How and when did you come here to Notre Dame?
So I started in 2015. I actually was hired in 2014, but I deferred for a year to take a fellowship in Germany. And I was really excited to be able to come to Notre Dame because Notre Dame is, one of the best places to do medieval philosophy in the country. And I have so many great colleagues here working in medieval philosophy and in the history of philosophy broadly. So I have a lot of wonderful people to talk to.
So tell us a bit about what you teach and who are your students and what are they like?
Right. So I teach a lot of intro to philosophy. I love teaching our first-year philosophy requirement to first-year students. One of the most exciting things for me is to be able to introduce students to the possibility of thinking through things that they just take for granted. So concepts like what is a cause? What does it mean for something to cause something else? Yeah. Why is there something rather than nothing? If we argue about whether some behavior is just or unjust, what is justice? And I really loved having these discussions with them. I love Notre Dame students. They're really bright and engaged and intellectually curious. So I teach a lot of those classes. I also teach ancient and medieval philosophy for our majors, and I teach courses for the graduate program. So in my specialization in medieval philosophy, Thomas Aquinas, the history of theories of mind, and that sort of thing.
Where did you first meet Thomas, and what drew you in to actually become, this is your area?
Yeah, so I think I probably read Aquinas for the first time when I was in college. So as a theology major, we read a lot of Thomas Aquinas in the courses that I was taking. And what attracted me to his writings particularly was just this sense of being a kind of systematic whole. So Aquinas doesn't just focus on a couple little topics. Yeah. He's really interested in putting together an entire picture of all of the different aspects of reality. And really interweaving not only, science and philosophy, metaphysics, ethics, but also theology. So he's really got this big picture in which you can integrate the life of faith and also our knowledge of the natural world. And I found that incredibly attractive. And from, the first few pages I was reading, I was completely hooked.
Yeah. He's kind of hard. The construction is so different than what we do, right? You read the Summa, and if it's your first time reading it and you don't have a guide, it seems everything backwards and unconnected.
Yes, I think Aquinas is one of those thinkers that because he's got a reputation for extreme clarity and precision, people sometimes think, okay, I'll just go online and I'll read the Summa Theologiae. It's all on there. The Dominicans have made it available in English online. And then then there's often a kind of sense of discouragement. You start reading the articles and you realize, okay, he's presupposing everything else in his system in order to be able to understand this one problem. And so I think it's good just diving into Aquinas, maybe not to start immediately with the text, but to look at a good introduction and get your feet wet and a sense of the whole, and then you can start to be able to parse what's happening in the text a little more easily.
Yeah. What is a good book for a beginner to read?
So Father Stephen Brock has a great book that he recently published. I think it's called An Introduction to the Thought of Thomas Aquinas, and he has a chapter on all of the major themes, and it's really well done, so I recommend that to my students a lot.
Wonderful. Well, you were recently appointed to the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas. So tell us a bit about what the Academy does.
Yeah, so the Pontifical Academies are sort of like think tanks of various sorts for the Vatican. There's 10 Pontifical Academies. The most recent one was founded, I think, in the in the early 2000s, the Pontifical Academy for Latin, and one of the oldest ones is the Pontifical Academy of the Sciences, which was founded in the 1600s. So the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas was founded in 1897 by Pope Leo XIII. So one of the big accomplishments of Pope Leo XIII was to elevate the study of Thomas Aquinas as a figure of particular importance for the Catholic intellectual tradition. And so one of the things he wanted to do was bring together in a kind of honorary society scholars working in Aquinas' philosophy and theology. So there's 50 of us. These are lifetime appointments. And what we do is get together once a year and talk about our research, talk about themes that are of particular importance to the life of the Church today. Those conference results are gathered together in a volume every year. So we try to focus on issues and questions where the thought of Thomas Aquinas can have a special relevance to contemporary life.
Yeah. I happen to know that next year there's a conference that the Pontifical Academy is hosting, right?
Yes, we're very excited about that. So it's the International Thomistic Congress. This will be the 11th one. The first one took place in 1925. Wow. And it's been a long time since we've had one. And so that's one of the things that the Academy is trying to do, is to revive this practice as a way of bringing Thomists from around the world together.
Sure. There haven't been a lot of appointments of late, right? When's the last time somebody has been appointed to the Academy prior to now?
That's a good question. So I'm not sure who the most recent appointee is, given that it's relatively small, and usually people, the term ends either because they retire or because they pass away. Yeah. So it doesn't happen that often. But so there's one other woman on the Academy right now from Argentina. And then the first woman, I believe, was a nun who was earlier in the 20th century. Okay.
It's kind of interesting that it took until the late 19th century for there to be an academy, given, the story is that the Summa was part of the texts that were honored at the Council of Trent.
Right. Yeah. Right.
The story is told that it was the Gospels and the Summa on the altar.
Yeah, and the Summa has been a big part of Jesuit education for a long time as well. So it's had this, and then the Dominican education, of course. So it's had this important place in the training of priests and religious for a long time, certainly, and then also in Catholic schools generally. But I think for Leo XIII, it was a way of looking at trying to find a figure from the history of Catholic thought whose thought really distinctively represents some of the key concerns that face Catholics. And he really wanted, I think, Aquinas to be elevated, or to his thought to receive extra prominence. Because the issues that Aquinas is concerned with are the issues that many questions that Catholics raise about faith and the nature of the human being and our final destiny. And So there's a lot of really interesting existential questions there. And it's interesting to see, so Pope John Paul II reformed the Academy in, I believe it was 1999, after writing the letter Fides et Ratio. Mm-hmm. So he wrote this apostolic letter called Inter Munera Academiarum, in which he described why he thought that the Academy had a special place for the thought of the modern world. And I actually brought the text. I thought I would read the formulation that he uses, because particularly beautiful. He says, "In the cultural conditions of our time, it seems truly appropriate to develop further this part of Thomistic doctrine which deals with humanity, given that his assertions on the dignity of the human person and the use of his reason, in perfect harmony with the faith, make St. Thomas a teacher for our time." Wow. And he really sees the thought of Thomas Aquinas as being something in which the human person, the embodiment of the person, the orientation of the person toward transcendence and toward a loving relationship with God, that there's something there that can be of particular service to contemporary Catholics struggling to find themselves in the modern world.
Very much a focus on his kind of anthropology.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. That's inspiring. That's great. Well, what are the other kinds of things that you are interested in kind of professionally? So, Thomas, and then?
Right. So I'm really interested in the history of philosophy of mind. So one of the things that I work on in the 13th century in Aquinas and Aquinas' predecessors is the nature of the human mind. How does he think it works? Is it material or immaterial? These questions I think are really interesting. And these questions, I think, when we look at how they were answered in time periods very distant from our own, we get new perspectives and new ways of thinking about the mind and what it might mean to have a mind and what the difference is between human minds and animal minds. So I think of myself in some respects as an archaeologist who goes back and recovers theories that have just gotten buried over under layers of sediment. And one of the really interesting historical trends that I track in some of my work is the reception of thought from the Islamic world in Aquinas' lifetime. So Aquinas is occupying this incredibly important point in the history of Western thought when there's this whole new stream of ideas coming in, philosophical ideas, from the Arabic-speaking world, and they're being translated into Latin, and they're being read at the University of Paris, where Aquinas is a student. And so thinkers at the time are trying to figure out how do we integrate these ideas with the ones that we're already familiar with from, say, Augustine and the Church Fathers. And Aquinas is embarking on this incredibly creative process, which is already really something he's taking over from his teacher, Albert the Great, of trying to bring these traditions together into a coherent whole. And so part of what I do is track how that got done.
Yeah, that's particularly interesting and couldn't be any more relevant to even, our current conversation, right? The idea of the interplay of civilizations and cultures.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think we have this notion now that's very current that we see in a lot of popular media and online, that Islam and Christianity have just been in this civilizational battle since the dawn of time, and I think what we see when we look at the intellectual interaction here that's happening in the Middle Ages, we see a really different side of that relationship, a story that's not told as much, where there's really a kind of shared philosophical project that's being carried on by these two religious groups that share a commitment to monotheism, and so they share a lot of philosophical commitments.
Especially because the Islamic thinkers were themselves dealing with Aristotle and kind of preserving those writings and responding to them and trying to figure out how they related to their monotheism.
Yes,
as well.
And I think we tend to forget when we think about Aristotle in the Middle Ages. How did Aristotle get into circulation at the University of Paris in the 13th century? And the tradition of reading Aristotle, the commentary traditions, this is all coming through the Arabic philosophical community who for centuries had been writing commentaries and developing the Aristotelian tradition coming out of the Greek background in Northern Africa and in the Middle East. And that whole tradition is just getting picked up then in the Latin tradition. So you really see a kind of continuity from Greece to Baghdad to Toledo and then again to Paris.
Yeah. Wow. Well, now, you are also a member of the De Nicolas Center's Faculty Advisory Committee. So how did you first get involved with the DCEC?
Well, as you know, Carter is very good at connecting with faculty and reaching out. And I think I had been on campus maybe 2 weeks when he came to talk to me. So it's been great to work with the De Nicolas Center since then. And a lot of the student fellows end up in my classes, and they've been a real treat to teach because they have this huge enthusiasm for medieval thought and ancient thought. I have some of them in my class right now, and then also I've been involved with some of the pro-life work that some of these students do. So most recently, the pro-life apologetics group asked me to come and talk to them about some famous arguments that are sort of up for debate in the pro-life, pro-choice kind of debates. So we had a wonderful conversation about that. I mean, I'm so impressed with these students and the incredible work that they're doing and the commitment that they show and really the training and support that they receive through the De Nicolas Center. It's really impressive.
Wonderful. So what are you working on now? What is next to come from your desk?
Well, right now I'm finishing up a book on Aquinas' theory of knowing as being. And so the idea of this book is to look at what kind of being is the mind, and how can we think about knowing less in terms of developing a connection with the extramental world and more in terms of a kind of transformation of the person. And so the way I like to think about it is that for Aquinas, knowing is like growing. When you're learning something, if you're a college student at Notre Dame and you're going through your classes and you're learning all these new ideas, your mind as a part of you is growing and developing just in exactly the same way that a sapling is growing into a tree and you're putting forth new branches and new leaves. And just like a tree is able to do things that a sapling can't do as it's reaching maturity, the ways in which you grow through knowledge are enabling you to do new things. So I'm really interested in this metaphysical way of thinking about knowing in terms of a development of the human person, which I think gets obscured sometimes when we focus so much on a kind of way of thinking about knowing is just making connections with an outside world.
Yeah. That has also, of course, ramifications for AI as well, right? Because computers,
yes,
as they begin to make not just the connections, but they increase their own ability, and that just snowballs.
Yes, and so you can see this as mimicking something that the human mind does as a kind of open-ended self-development, right? And it raises all sorts of interesting questions about whether whether the ability to do that is something that indicates that something has a mind, right? Should we say that an AI has a mind? This is, of course, a topic of great interest for philosophy classrooms.
Right.
Yeah, but there's a lot of important implications, I think, even in the work of Aquinas for thinking about AI intelligence, because he really wants to say that there's an essential feature of cognitive activity or mental activity is consciousness. And he thinks that consciousness requires a kind of feel, a kind of, what it is like of, there's a feel to having a sensation or having a thought. And he thinks that that's not possible except for something that's immaterial to some degree. So I think from a Thomistic perspective, if we look at AI, then we would want to say, well, AI can't, given the material structures that it has, can't be something that has consciousness. But, the field's still open on that one.
Sure. Yeah. To what extent the fact that Thomas Aquinas was a priest, this, of course, as you say, he was not only in philosophy but also theology. How about the reader of Thomas?
Right.
Can you approach Thomas as a total unbeliever? And obviously, there's value there. But what does approaching Thomas as a person of faith?
Right.
What effect does that have?
Right. So this is a question that comes up sometimes in my ancient and medieval class. If the students want to know if we're reading this material from authors who are theologians and philosophers, and then the views are so systematic, can we really extract Aquinas' philosophy for someone who's a non-believer? And I think the answer is sort of on the one hand and on the other hand. So
drawing a distinction. Either find Dominican tradition.
Exactly. As Aquinas might do himself.
Yes.
So just on the one hand, just as reading any text, it's very important to be aware of the context and of the background of the author and of the various things that the author prioritizes. So too with Aquinas, I think we can't fully come to grips with the views if we're not willing to take at all seriously the text where he talks about concepts that are traditionally associated as religious concepts. So an example of this is his theory on the human mind and human knowing. It's really hard to get the complete picture of what he thinks about human knowing unless we pay some attention to the text where he's talking about angelic knowledge. And so I think it's not really possible to read Aquinas' philosophy if in abstraction from his theology, if what that means is we just don't read any of the texts where he talks about the theological stuff. Because sometimes that's where the test cases are happening, where you actually get a better picture of what's going on philosophically. But on the other hand, Aquinas is a thinker who's very committed to the possibility that human reason has a kind of domain. And there are things that can be known by human reason, and then there are that are in its sort of unaided quest for truth, going through the natural world, observing, reflecting on experience, drawing conclusions from principles. And that when the human being is doing theology, what we're doing is we're adding new data to the database. And so the datum of revelation, that God is a Trinity, that Jesus is God incarnate. So these are basically new bits of data that we can then continue with human reason to reflect on. And
so we can't achieve by human reason on our own.
Exactly. So they're things that are taken on testimony, and then we know them through faith. And so as a result, it's possible then to make a principled distinction when you're reading Aquinas. Is the conclusion that he's drawing right here, is that something that I need that datum of revelation in order to reach that conclusion? Or is that a conclusion that I can reach just using the datum that's possible through sense experience and through philosophical reasoning? And so there's a ton of Aquinas' philosophy where I think a person who doesn't have a commitment to the Catholic faith can still get a lot out of his philosophical thought just as a kind of system in its own right.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Therese, thank you so much for opening our eyes to that much, at least.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ken.
Yeah, and congratulations to your appointment and
Thank you.
all the work that comes with that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to Professor Cory. You will find links to her book and to a talk about Muslim philosophers and Aquinas that she delivered for the Thomistic Institute in the show notes. Subscribe to Ethics and Culture Cast so that you can always get the latest episodes by visiting ethicscenter.nd.edu/podcast. We would love your feedback. Please review the show on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts, and email your suggestions to cecpodcast@nd.edu. Our theme music is I Don't Know by Grapes, licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution License. We'll see you next time on Ethics and Culture Cast. Until then, make good decisions.